is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Pay heed all who enter and beware this podcast. That's right, this is the Pay Heed podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, along with Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. And we are here to react to and break down and analyze some of all that's happening at Big 12 Media Days throughout the early part of this week. Kansas with Lance Leipold and Jalon Daniels and Devin Neal speaking on Wednesday afternoon. If you're listening to this later in the week, speaking on Wednesday, we'll get into some of their thoughts and also some of the general situation around the Big 12, because as always, you got Coach Prime, who seems to have a whole posse of people just following him around. You've got Kyle Whittingham saying, yeah, I'm not going to be here in 2 years, and all this other craziness. So Big 12 Media Days, certainly, I don't think disappointed this year. But before we kind of get into all that stuff, I do want to kind of touch on, to start here, with Brett Yormark giving his opening comments to about the Big 12. And Kevin, I don't know how you feel about Brett Yormark. For me, Brett Yormark is an eminently fascinating character in the sense that sometimes he's like a mad scientist in a good way, and sometimes he's like a mad scientist in a bad way.
And he's part mad scientist. He's part, like slick businessman, and part wrestling heel, right? Like he's got like all of that in there, and and he can bring that all out in the same podium session. There are some guys that get out there and they, we've seen, like Missouri's Eli Drinkwitz, for instance, be wrestling heel. But like generally, like when he's wrestling heel, whereas Yormark can kind of jump between the different parts. Nick, I understand there was one part of his comments that really stood out to you, maybe about the Big 12 not being done or not being close.
Yeah, so Brett Yormark, this was like, 2 years ago at this point, where he made a somewhat famous statement of the Big 12 is open for business, a la expansion, a la the Big 12 wants to grow. And he stayed true to that comment, because in the end, the Big 12 did eventually, expand, re-adding Colorado and then adding the Pac-12 schools, Utah and Arizona State, basically throwing them a lifeline with the Pac-12 ship sinking. It's now sunk, RIP, Washington State, Oregon State. Sorry, you guys got left behind. You didn't make it. Sorry, guys. But yeah, the most interesting thing is that he sort of doubled down on that comment and reiterated it and said it again earlier this week at Big 12 Media Days, suggesting that the Big 12 may not be done expanding again. And my first thought, I think, was probably you're looking at a Gonzaga, maybe. That was a team that I think was kind of rumored or last year at one point or another, adding them as a basketball school. But obviously, if you want to keep things kind of balanced, you'd have to add more. But I think it's pretty obvious that Brett Yormark is, and this is a positive, I think, in this situation for Brett Yormark, is that he is very much aware of sort of the new dynamic of college athletics, which is it's an arms race between the Big 12, the SEC, and the Big 10, right? And no matter how you try to paint it, no matter what lens you try to view it through, the Big 12 is objectively in third behind the SEC and the Big 10. That's just how it is. You look at revenue sharing, you look at sort of, the prestige is maybe not the right term, but just sort of the general national atmosphere of the conferences. The Big 10 and the SEC are ahead of the Big 12 right now. And so I think Brett Yormark is very much aware of that. And I think it's pretty clear that he is actively trying to pursue various different avenues of catching up and maybe even surpassing the Big 10 and the SEC, whether that means expanding and adding even more teams, right? The Big 12 Mexico thing obviously kind of got shifted a little bit, but that's another thing where I think he's trying to do something different and really, step out of the shadow of the SEC and the Big 10. On the flip side, though, we're talking about all this, and yet the Big 12 Media Days are in Las Vegas, where if you want to take the SEC approach or the SEC viewpoint here, the SEC pushed the Big 12 out of Dallas, out of Arlington, basically. They basically took over, and the Big 12 ran away, essentially. So, I don't know. I was very curious about that. I think from the KU perspective, my biggest takeaway and sort of my biggest thought for a long time has been, as long as KU is in a stable conference, I think you can feel pretty satisfied with where KU is at, right? Whether that is the Big 10 or the SEC or the Big 12, I don't really care which one it is. As long as it's a situation that is stable for KU, I think that's probably what's most important. And to me, there's no question the Big 12 is stable right now. Now, in the next 4 or 5 years, will the Big 12 still be stable in comparison to the SEC and the Big 10? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? Maybe we'll consolidate and reform the NCAA again and it'll all come for a circle. I don't know. But for now, I'm okay with where KU was at. And I think you just kind of have to ride with Brett Yormark, I guess, and see what the hell he's going to do on this roller coaster of college athletics.
Yeah, bring back the Big Eight, right? It is, it's interesting and sort of fascinating to watch Yormark because he does see things in a very different way. And I don't think that there's a whole lot of doubt. Maybe I'm taking a step too far, but I'm not sure that the reason the Big 12 exists today and the Pac-12 doesn't isn't because of the difference in leadership between those two conferences. And where you look at where both schools were, where you look at the TV deals that both were kind of looking at, when you look at, Yormark has, we brought up all the different traits that he has. He's got some P.T. Barnum to him too, doesn't he? In terms of, come look inside the Big Tent and getting people excited for different things. The Big 12 outlasted the Pac-12. The Big 12 right now, it looks fairly solid to potentially outlast the ACC. When you look at the troubles there, when you look at some of the teams that won out there, a lot of the question, like you said, from a Kansas standpoint, revolves around how solid is the Big 12 going to be if the ACC is open for bidding. Clemson, North Carolina, Florida State, properties like that go somewhere. Does that open another round of realignment where Kansas is potentially in a spot to jump to one of those other leagues? Or do they feel, hey, the Big 12 is solid, we're in a good place here, whatever else? I think that's a really fascinating discussion to have, and Kansas is in a very different spot, I think, right now as it stands to where they were 3 or 4 years ago. They aren't the worst, Power 5 or now Power 4 program in football with a bullet. They, facility issues, they're taking a huge bite out of facility issues. And if you go back and look at where Kansas was in, say, 2008-ish, where obviously you had some football success. I'm not talking about the Orange Bowl year. I'm actually talking about the next year. Kansas was up pretty high in revenues and things like that. And so I hesitate, sleeping giant is probably too strong, but there is a level of Kansas, financially from an eyeball standpoint, things like that we haven't really seen the school be able to tap into from a realignment standpoint that is maybe starting to get a little bit prettier, that picture getting a little bit rosier. And so, like you said, it is sort of fascinating to see, hey, where is the Big 12 going to be? Can the Big 12, I'm not saying they have to catch the Big 10 in revenue, certainly not have to catch the SEC in revenue or whatever else, but can they get within spitting distance? Is it the sort of thing where they feel like they're not leaving a lot on the table by staying in the Big 12? And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if that'll be the case or not, but I do think that it feels like Brett Yormark is kind of the one guy that can keep the Big 12, maybe within that distance or that gap to where you can feel relatively good about staying in the Big 12.
Yeah, and I think from the outside perspective, maybe from a fan's perspective, you might sit back and say, wait a minute, the Big Ten SEC, they are having these large revenue shares, right? And I think it's very easy to get fixated on sort of the short term of that money, right? Like, it's all a money grab. Just focus on that, while losing sight of maybe the bigger picture, right? And I think Texas and Oklahoma, you cover Texas, they might be in for a rude awakening this year because in the Big 12, they were far and away the top national brands. They're the SEC. They're like what, the 5th or 6th national brands?
See, I will disagree. Texas typically, if they're not number one in revenue, they're close, and so Texas is a top national brand, but there's not a gap there like there was in the Big 12, where it was like Texas, in terms of revenue and brand and everything, and Oklahoma, and then the rest of the Big 12 down here. You have other schools that are in those ranges that can do a lot of those same things. I think one of the things that Texas has done so well is kind of spread the wealth across that athletic department. Obviously, really good in a lot of different sports. But to your point, Texas last year was really good. It was a college football playoff team. They beat Alabama at Alabama. So I don't want to say that they wouldn't have won the Big 12, won the SEC. Obviously, Alabama won the SEC. But at the same time, there's a difference between your third or fourth hardest team being what they are potentially in the Big 12 and playing, say, LSU or somebody like that in a year where they're fairly up.
Well, I guess let me put it to you this way. When you think about sort of that national brand idea, do you think Kansas is in position to, or maybe they already are, the biggest national brand in the Big 12 at this point with no more Texas and no more Oklahoma? Are they there? Can they get there, or are they already there?
Yeah, I think they can get there. I think, obviously you would look at some of the schools that are in, major metropolitan areas. TCU, I get it's Fort Worth and not technically Dallas, but Dallas-Fort Worth, helping them there. I think Texas Tech has had such a level of investment over the last few years when you look at the facilities and all the different things there. But, and I'm sure we're going to talk Mike Gundy here in a minute, but one of the things that Mike Gundy said that wasn't, super panned was the fact that somebody asked him about, hey, is it sort of a race to see who is going to be the dominant Big 12 program? And they weren't talking, I don't think, about athletics programs, brands or whatever, but there is a little bit of that, right? To see, hey, who's going to be the best program in the Big 12 from a football standpoint over the next 3, 4, 5 years. And we've talked about the opportunity that Kansas has ahead of them this year. If Kansas reaches the Big 12 title game this year, if Kansas puts itself in a spot to potentially win a Big 12 title this year, you would think that could kind of change the trajectory of the program, especially with the investment and different things that you can see there. It's also one of those things where you could have a missed opportunity, right? Where if you have the next 5 years, you look at, a program that has had the level of investment, you look at TCU potentially, from a recruiting standpoint, they could be the best in the Big 12. They have, a lot of eyeballs potentially right there in Dallas-Fort Worth, all of those different things. If TCU spends the next 5 years going 6-6 or whatever, and somebody else is able to kind of start off and lay claim to being, one of those top few programs, it could be a giant missed opportunity for somebody who doesn't take advantage of that too.
I do want to talk more about this, and we'll get more into specifically what Lance Leipold and what Jalon Daniels said and more from Big 12 Media Days. First, we've got to take our break here. As always, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel. Be sure to go check out homefieldapparel.com. I'm repping my Jock Relay shirt today. This is the shirt, people. This is the shirt where somebody on the street, I am not making this up. I swear to you, I'm not making this up. A man on the street said, hey, where's your shirt from? I told Home Field Apparel. And listen, if you haven't bought Home Field Apparel yet, we can hook you up here with code PAYHEED24 at checkout of your first checkout for Home Field Apparel.
They had a 1995 Aloha Bowl wedding T-shirt that I saw on the site where I was kind of like, oh, that's a good looking shirt right there.
One other thing I'd like to point out here is that if you're a college football fan, as I'm sure you are for listening to the show, if you are planning on getting the new college football NCAA 25 game, Home Field has what they are calling a Dynasty Shop Pack. It is where you buy and you get a random generated any college they have, right? Which is pretty cool. If you're thinking of, man, what college am I going to be for my Dynasty in NCAA 25? Home Field Apparel's got you covered there as well. PAYHEED24 is the code. You can head over there for 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. Speaking of college football 25, we're going to talk about a little bit about that as well coming up next.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, along with Kevin Flaherty. Touched on quite a bit there to begin the show about the state of the Big 12, some of Brett Yormark's comments, so on and so forth. I want to get more into specifically what Lance Leipold said, what Jalon Daniels said. One other quick thing, though, that I want to mention here that happened this week is NCAA Football 25 is going to be coming out next week, and we may end up doing a whole show on this. I don't know. I love it, so I want to talk about it. I don't know about you, Kevin, but they did this thing where they released their top 100 rated players for the game, which is coming out next week, and KU will represent it in the top 100. They had 3 players make the top 100 of NCAA Football 25's rated players. You had Jalon Daniels and Kobe Bryant, both in the 70s, and Devin Neal came in as the 42nd best player in EA Sports' NCAA Football 25 rankings. Listen, I would like to preface this entire conversation by saying this. It means nothing. It's a video game. It's completely irrelevant. But listen, we're in the dog days. We still got about 7 weeks.
It means everything.
We still got about 7 weeks before the start of the season. I just want to preface this by saying it's totally irrelevant. That being said, the 3 players that Kansas had in the top 100, that is tied for the most out of any team in the Big 12, according to the NCAA 25 with 3. Arizona was the other school that had 3. Interestingly enough, Kansas State, and Utah, and Utah both had zero players in the top 100 rated players by NCAA 25. But Kevin, let's break this down. You just said it. It means everything. It means everything. You got Devin Neal, Kobe Bryant, Jalon Daniels up in the top 100 for NCAA 25.
Jalon Daniels is how I know that it's possible to really like a rating and also be really mad about it at the same time. Because Jalon Daniels being a top 10 quarterback in the game, being the number 2 quarterback to Shedeur Sanders in Colorado, being a 90 overall, all of those things, I think, you're pretty happy about. Getting an 88 speed rating is going to make him really fun. This game has that wear and tear feature where, you can take too many shots. Your guy, it's not getting injured per se, but your guy gets worn down a little bit. So you take a few shots to your throwing arm, your quarterback's not throwing the ball as far, things like that. But at the same time, Jalon Daniels being the 70, was it 5th?
79th?
79th, yeah, because Kobe Bryant was 75th. Jalon Daniels being the 79th best player in college football, I thought that was too low. I think if you're lining up all the college football players on the goal line and having me, pick the best guys, I think that's probably too low for Jalon. So that's how, on one hand, you're excited. He's the top 10 quarterback in the game. He's got good speed, so he's going to be fun to play with. He's got a good ranking overall, but his spot within the top Big 12 players, I think he was 11th or so, 12th in the Big 12, and his spot nationally, I felt like were a little bit too low. How about Devin Neal being the number 1 guy on Kansas's team, being I'm sure you're going to talk about this, being the number 3 running back in the Big 12. He and Taj Brooks have the same rating, but Taj Brooks is 6 spots overall higher on the 100 list.
I don't know how they calculate.
I think, we've talked about the fact that, I helped write the Lindy's preview for Kansas and for the Big 12. And in the anonymous coaches section, the coaches that I talked to about Kansas, one of the common threads was a lot of people thought Devin Neal was Kansas's best player. That he was the guy that when you play Kansas, even with a healthy Jalon Daniels, Devin's the guy that you kind of go out and you feel like this is the fulcrum. This is the guy that you really need to slow down.
Yeah, and I would be remiss without mentioning the actual ratings. You kind of touched on it there. So sure. Jalon Daniels comes in with a 90 overall rating according to NCAA 25. Kobe Bryant's rating was also a 90 as well. And Devin Neal came in with a 92 overall rating. So there you go. Those are the ratings he got for Kansas. Again, also something that I should point out, Kansas, again, tied for the most with anybody in the Big 12 for most players in the top 100 for the NCAA 25. Arizona had 3. Oklahoma State had 2. Colorado had 2. I'll give you one guess on who the 2 players Colorado had in the top 100. It was a Shedeur Sanders and depth. And then I think a couple other Big 12 schools had 1 or 2. And then, but again, really the most interesting thing also I thought was the fact that the top 2 teams in the Big 12 picked to finish Big-12, Kansas State and Utah both had 0, which is
yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's a game, but still.
The other thing that I thought was interesting was there were no 99s overall, no 98s, no 97s, across the entire country. So the top-ranked player was a 96. Ollie Gordon of Oklahoma State was the top-ranked Big 12 player. He was a 96-rated guy, so, was kind of tied for that top rating, was number 3 overall nationally. But when you look at Devin Neal, it's not a gap from 92 to 99. It's 92 to 96 as the top players in the entire country. So certainly, a lot of praise there for him. I think the Big 12, we've talked about the running back group. I think they had 4 of the top 14 running backs when you add R.J. Harvey of UCF into that mix. And so, the Big 12 had 7 of the top 50 players, one of whom was Devin Neal, 15 of the top 100, and of those 15, 3 of them were Jayhawks.
Yeah, and just as a quick aside here, really, about the game itself, is that EA Sports, the developers of NCAA 25, they seem pretty committed to making the game more difficult, more challenging to players, and I think that's reflected in kind of what you talked about there with the rating system, whereas like before they would just be tossing out 99s. I mean, everybody was a 99, willy-nilly, whatever. So I don't know. I'm excited. I think the game might be more challenging. If you're going to play the game, let us know in the comments. Let us know if you're watching on YouTube. You can let us know in the comments what team you're going to be. Right? I still haven't chosen what dynasty team I'm going to pick with yet. I had a long running dynasty in NCAA Football 14, which was the last NCAA football game with Western Kentucky. I was like 10-time national champions of Western Kentucky. I'm trying to decide if I just want to continue with Western Kentucky or pick a new team. So I don't know. I'm still up in the air. Obviously, I'll have my Kansas dynasty, but I got to pick a fun one also.
It sounds like recruiting is going to be a lot tougher too. You're not just, hey, you're in your 4th year at Western Kentucky, you're going to land 15 5-star guys or whatever. So I mean that's going to be fun to see. I think, like you were saying, I think they're trying to make it a little bit more of a challenge, make it to where, hey, if you want to build up a Western Kentucky or whoever, in East Carolina and turn them into one of the top teams in the country, it's going to be more of a process. It's not going to be just, hey, your first year, you're going to go 10-2, and your second year, you're going to win a national title, and you're going to be out recruiting everybody, which was kind of the case for some of the other games. And so I'm interested to see how this whole thing works out. They've talked about, some of the traits that the players are going to have, which, is a sort of a Madden thing. It's also, I'm somebody that plays FC, which used to be known as FIFA. Traits really influence sort of how a player plays. It's the difference between 2 guys who can seem very similar. And so I think there's a chance that playing as somebody like Jalon Daniels is going to feel like playing with Jalon Daniels, not just because of the speed, but there may be a trait there where he's able to make plays, when plays break down. He may be able to throw on the run really well. And so there are going to be some different things there to try and add an element of realism to the game, I think, too.
Speaking of Jalon Daniels, he was one of the players that represented KU at Big 12 Media Days in Las Vegas. Had a chance to speak on Wednesday afternoon, and certainly, I think the foremost question regarding Jalon Daniels is revolving around his health, right? This is going to be an ongoing thing, I think, for Jalon Daniels, given the fact that he's had multiple seasons now where they've been cut short by injury. Obviously, that with the back injury last year, only played in 3 games for KU. And so one of the first questions he was asked on his ESPN interview was, what's your health status? What are you doing about your health? And, Jalon Daniels, I think the one of the things we can't really under-highlight about Jalon Daniels, or maybe one of the things we should talk more about him, is he is a very, very well-spoken individual and an excellent ambassador for Kansas. In fact, Lance Leipold kind of made an extra point to say, hey, once Devin Neal and Jalon Daniels move on, like, KU needs to make sure that those guys are still, being the type of ambassadors for KU that they have been as they've been student athletes for KU. So that was something pretty cool. But yeah, beyond that, Jalon Daniels made some comments about his health and how he's feeling and so on and so forth. And one of the things that stood out to me, and listen, this is just me overreacting a little bit hitting the panic button sort of is Jalon Daniels mentioned that if there was a game tomorrow, he would play. I don't know that I would necessarily phrase it that way, because to me that makes it seem like there's a possibility that he wouldn't play, I guess. I don't know. That comment made me a little bit, it had me unsettled a little bit. But overall, I think you got to be happy with how Jalon Daniels was sounding and what he was saying about his health and making sure that he is good to go for KU. Because, right, I mean, as much as you want to talk about, you said Devin Neal being the best player for Kansas, unfortunately, I still think KU's hopes really for a Big 12 title, for a college football playoff run, still revolve around the quarterback position with Jalon Daniels and him staying healthy.
Yeah, he's probably the most important player. And, especially when you look at it, and this isn't a knock on Cole Ballard or Isaiah Marshall, both of them are fairly inexperienced. Cole Ballard got absolutely thrown into the fire, last year. And so he does have a little bit of game time, but there's a bigger drop off from Jalon to Cole probably than there is from Devin Neal to Daniel Highshaw, who, might be 1,000-yard type back if Devin Neal just didn't exist. And so when you look at it that way, I 100% hear what you're saying. Lance Leipold at the podium made a little bit of a quip that he felt like, some of the things the players had to do, for video or whatever behind him. He was like, he probably needs to stretch, for some of that stuff. You want to be as careful as you possibly can. I'm maybe not as worried as you are. I mean, I don't know if it's because I went to the spring showcase or whatever, and seeing Jalon kind of not just being out there for a little bit, but making throws, with torque, being able to twist, and even beyond that, like as somebody who has had some back injuries for old age / other things, when your back hurts, you're not very mobile or whatever else, and Jalon was kind of dancing around on the sidelines and things like that. When my back hurts, I'm not dancing for anybody. So, I mean, I'm maybe not, in that spot. I do think, obviously, his health is really important. It is kind of funny, though, because, last year he got injured, or 2 years ago, he was injured in the 6th game, was able to return, wound up ultimately playing 9 games. I think the online narrative is, he'll be lucky to play 4 games. And it's like, well, he only didn't play 4 games last year. That was the only time that he didn't. And so when you look at it that way, I do think, I'm not saying there aren't questions about the durability, because there are. I tend to look at things a little bit differently, because back injuries are different than shoulder injuries. If it was the sort of thing where he had injured the same knee 3 seasons in a row, you'd be sitting here like, I don't know. But I don't know that, that Jalon is as injury prone necessarily as people are making it out to be. I think when you look at the hit that separated his shoulder against TCU, that would have separated anybody's shoulder.
Oh, yeah.
That he came down and whatever else. And so it's not necessarily like, hey, he's had a bunch of non-contact injuries, or, hey, whatever else. He did have the nagging back injury, but I do think that he's somebody that you're going to want to, probably be careful with. But at the same time, I'm maybe not as worried about it as some other people potentially are.
The other thing that Jalon Daniels mentioned that I wanted to bring up here is talking about Jeff Grimes, talking about sort of the new offense, and he sort of made an extra point to emphasize that Jeff Grimes had some special twists. And then when pressed a little further, he just said, keep an eye on like formational type stuff. And I know that stuff that you always like, Kevin, is the motions and formation, changing all that stuff. And so it seems like that's going to continue to be a significant part of KU's offensive strategy, right? I mean, I think that was kind of what Andy Kolicki brought to KU was, you think back to like the Armaze Reed Adams in motion, destroying a guy on a 3-yard run or whatever. But it seems like that's going to be sticking around with Jeff Grimes. And I mean, I don't want to gloss over the Jeff Grimes addition, because I think it's definitely important to mention it. You have all these experienced players coming back for KU with Jalon Daniels, with Devin Neal, with the wide receivers, even with some of the guys on the offensive line. How much does Jeff Grimes want to impress upon this offense his own philosophy, his own thought process, and how much will he just come in and say, hey, you know what? These dudes have been around, they're experienced, they played together. I'm just going to kind of let them do their thing and maybe, not so much try to force my specific strategy onto them. I do think it's an interesting question, and it's something I'll be very curious to see, especially early in the year for KU.
Yeah, I think even when you're running the exact same system, like no changes whatsoever, you're going to have differences from play caller to play caller. Somebody is going to favor, hey, it's 3rd and 8. This is what I like to call in this situation, versus somebody else saying, hey, it's 3rd and 8. This is what I want to run. One of the things that Andy Kotelnicki was terrific at was using a lot of those motions and different looks and things like that to gain leverage in the running game. And, Kansas was always going to base out of wide zone. That was their big thing. Grimes is a guy that loves to base out of wide zone. And so that's still going to be sort of your primary building block. We've talked a little bit about this. I wonder if there's going to be a little bit less option for multiple reasons. One, Grimes doesn't have as much background with it as I think, Kotelnicki does. I think there's maybe a little bit more jet sweep and things like that could replace that, a little more screen game. But the other thing I think, too, is I think Grimes, one of the things that came out of the spring that some people talked about was using leverage and motions and things like that to be able to tap into KU's receiving core and get those guys into positions where, you're not just struggling to, hey, KU's got 7 guys on this side. We've only got 6 guys that are going to run the ball over there. But getting guys like Luke Grimm and Quentin Skinner in a spot where defenders are going to have to make choices, they're maybe not going to be able to have good leverage against the routes that they have. That's something that I think Kansas could take a step forward with, is they've thrown the ball pretty well the last few years, especially when you look at stats that basically say, here's what happened on the actual passing play in terms of if a player catches it and was shot dead immediately where he caught the ball, like here's how effective that pass play was. But I do think that that's something where Grimes could maybe have some success, is using some of those motions, using some of that to maybe push the ball downfield and put guys into tough situations where you're putting some really good wide receivers into advantageous places.
In terms of Lance Leipold and sort of some of the things that he talked about at Big 12 Media Days, I wouldn't say there was anything really too groundbreaking or too surprising from Lance Leipold. Mentioned a lot about, well, one of the things he did mention was kind of how he built the program, which was talking about reducing the penalties and playing a sort of a fundamentally sound version of football. Talked a little bit about DJ Warner, the addition of the top recruit, one of the top recruits in KU history, and how much he could impact this season for KU. One thing I do like about that is that Lance Leipold, I thought, did a good job of saying, hey, also we need to temper our expectations, because it's very rare that a true freshman that's not a quarterback, I guess, can come in and deal with the physicality of a high-level college football and play and make an impact in their first year in a program.
Yeah, it was when I covered Texas, one of the assistants had a saying. He basically said, the closer you are to the ball, the faster the game moves, right? If you're a defensive tackle and you take a wrong step, the play's probably over for you, right? Like it's going the other way. You're not getting back into that thing. And so he used that to talk a lot about, that's how difficult it is for players to come in as true freshmen. And so that's part of the reason it's so hard to come in and play immediately as a defensive lineman. Yes, the physicality is a huge part of it. The other part is that it's really fast and the game can move right by you if you're not doing exactly what you're supposed to do. He complimented DJ Warner saying, hey, this guy's been a sponge. He's asking a lot of the right questions. Buck O'Neil, at the Negro Leagues Museum had kind of a great saying about Cool Papa Bell, where he said that he could flip off the light switch and be under the covers in bed before it got dark. That was how quick he was. And DJ Warner has just fantastic quickness off the edge. If you're wondering, hey, why was DJ Warner such a highly rated recruit? Why did he go to the Army All-America game and have a big game there the way that he did? he's got just tremendous quickness and change of direction and all of those things. Is he going to be able to hold up physically? That's a fair question. The mental thing is going to be a big part of it. How fast is the game moving for him? Does he put himself in a position, Nick, where KU can throw him out there on, say, 3rd and 9 and say, hey, go do what you do best? I think that's the part that I'm going to be interested in. I'm not necessarily looking at him as, hey, he's going to have a great chance to start or anything like that. He still has some physical development to do. But can you get to a spot where you feel comfortable putting him out there in those situations?
One other thing that Lance Leipold talked about that I found pretty interesting, and there was actually sort of a display about this at Big 12 Media Days, that was the use of radio communications. Lance Leipold was kind of asked about it a little bit, and he gave a little bit of an explanation of, hey, KU was one of a few teams that were allowed to use those communications during their guaranteed rate bowl game against UNLV in 2023, and they utilized them a little bit in the spring. And at Big 12 Media Days, there was actually a demonstration of the different types of tablets. It'll look much more like the NFL. If you're someone who watches the NFL, you'll a lot of times see quarterbacks, you'll see coordinators, you'll see different people on the sideline with a tablet getting pictures or visuals of real live info from the game. That's something that's being added at the college level this year, along with the helmet communications. And I think it's something that could go maybe a little bit under the radar in terms of changes, because this is something that's significant, right? You're not going to see the rainbow-colored guys in sweaters on the sidelines flashing crazy signs and holding up, who knows what else, right? So it'll be a change, but we were kind of talking off the air, Kevin, about this before we started the show, about how for some players it could actually be a big benefit, right? If you're somebody who's coming in and trying to learn a system, maybe like a Bryce Foster, for instance, at the center position, where before you were trying to learn hand signals, you're trying to learn what signs mean what, and now through the helmet communication, it'll be much more streamlined and much clearer, and could help players understand faster and pick up faster the playbook and maybe what they're trying to do.
Yeah, you think about young and transfer quarterbacks in particular. I talked to a coach this offseason, and they had brought in a transfer quarterback, and partway through the spring, they weren't sure if he was going to get it. They were using their hand motions and cards and all of those different things, and he was kind of struggling to pick it up, and he wasn't playing very well. Once they went to the helmet communication, Nick, they said that they saw almost an immediate jump in his play because of that ability to communicate, to tell him what's going on, whatever else. And by the end of the spring, they felt like they really had something in this quarterback. And it sounds like such a small thing, but it can be that big of a difference. You think about somebody coming in to a new system, or even if they're just young within a certain system, it's like learning a foreign language, right? In terms of, you may call this play this, but somebody else calls it this. You may run this concept that you didn't really run wherever you were at before that. So that's going to be a big part. I'm really fascinated to see how the tablet thing works, with everybody doing it. One of the things that you hear from NFL games is coaches will say, well, people always say, halftime adjustments. In the NFL, you can't wait to halftime to adjust, right? Like, you're in trouble at that point. And so they have their tablets and all those things where after each possession, they can walk back and say, okay, this is the look that you're showing it. And so there's a lot more of a cat and mouse game. You have to have an adjustment to the adjustment to the adjustment, because you're going to come out, and do something to try and slow somebody down. They're going to see it quicker now, hopefully at least, and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And then what do you have, planned to kind of counter whatever they're going to do in that circumstance?
Yeah, I just find it so fascinating because so much of the college game is so often learning and developing, right? And getting players to understand what they're doing, right? You think about at the NFL level, a lot of times it's guys you already know sort of the X's and O's of what you're supposed to be doing. It just comes kind of comes down to execution, right? Whereas at the college level, it is really more about sort of learning and developing and understanding a system. And now with this process of the tablets, like you mentioned, and with the helmet communication, and then you throw in the fact that players, are able to transfer freely and whatnot. And now you could have guys who maybe would come into a program and, 10 years ago, it would have taken them half the season or a whole season to really get up to speed. Those guys might be able to become impact players more right away. And I think from KU's perspective, again, you think about a guy like Bryce Foster, who's going to come in and try to learn the offense very quickly. And this is a process or something that may benefit him very much to where he can integrate into KU's offense quicker. Now, the good news for Kansas is you look around like the rest of the offense, they've got veteran players at every position. So it shouldn't really, impact too much. And you look at the defensive side of the ball, kind of the same deal, right? You think in the secondary, KU's got four very, very talented veteran players in the secondary. They've got some linebackers that have been around as well. So I don't know how much of this will necessarily, significantly impact Kansas, but sort of in the wider breadth of the sport, it is something that is very interesting and something that is worth noting and monitoring as this is going to be the first year where everyone's kind of going to get their hands on it and be able to utilize it throughout the season.
Yeah, for KU, it could be really interesting to see how it works next year, right? When, I realize Jalon technically has 2 years left, but I don't know that we're expecting to see Jalon Daniels in a Kansas jersey in 2025.
Lance Leipold did say, hey, he could come back.
He can in fact come back. But the thing is, like, Kansas has a chance to be really good on the offensive line next year and on the defensive line next year. When you look at the tackles that would come back, when you look at the end group that could come back. And so it may be next year that you're kind of rolling in maybe a little bit less experience at linebacker and, quarterback and positions like that where, this could really be something that could help speed those guys along.
Overall, I mentioned it earlier in the week on one of our earlier shows. Big 12 Media Days, to me, is kind of like the official signal of, put your engines, go, go, go. The season's here. So all in all, I think it's very, very exciting. And you look at the state of the Big 12, it should be a fun year. Kansas' schedule seems favorable for them to possibly make some noise. Jalon Daniels is healthy. Lance Leipold seems to be feeling good. You look at this Kansas team, and this could be a very, very fun season for the Jayhawks as they look to get rolling here as we get closer to the start of fall camp and, of course, to the start of the season as well. So be sure to keep an eye out for our Jayhawk Rewind series as we've been doing throughout this offseason, going back, looking at the games in 2023 to help prepare for 2024. Keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for more of our coverage as we get ready for fall camp, as I just said, and then into the season as well. You'll definitely want to stay subscribed, whether you're watching or listening on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, wherever. Be sure to turn on your subscription. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment as well. Like I said, leave us a review. Let us know what your thoughts are maybe for KU heading into this season as well. And until then, be sure to keep following us here on the KU Podcast. For Kevin Flaherty, I'm Nick Springer. We will talk to you again soon. See ya.